As you do home improvement projects, you're going to have occasions where you have to cut off a long board or cut a piece off a full sheet of plywood, and sometimes that causes some challenges. If you're trying to cut this with a circular saw, the weight of the piece that's sticking out tends to bind the saw in the cut. This piece starts leaning down and it pinches the blade. So it's actually dangerous, because if that saw blade pinches and jams, the saw jumps back. That's called kickback, and that is a very dangerous situation. There's a couple other problems with it. The board will eventually fall off, and if this is going to be used for some kind of finished project, you're going to get damage to it. Also, sometimes when you're cutting like this, the weight of the cutoff piece at some point becomes too much, and the board will split, and you'll get a spike like that on the end of it, and again, that may ruin the other piece of wood. So those two reasons that this is not the best way to do this. If you're cutting sheets of plywood or other sheet goods, it's also very awkward, because it's hard to get to the middle of the sheet. It's hard to reach in with the saw, and also you have the same problem with the cutoffs falling off. So let me show you a solution to this. So I made these kind of mini sawhorses. I call them crickets. Not sure why I named them crickets, but that's what I call them. So how you use these is you lay these out so that the place where you want to cut the board is supported on each end. So you have two crickets on each end. The board is fully supported, and the off-cut part will not sag down, so you won't get the blade pinch problem, and you won't break off that spike as I just showed you. So you'll be able to cut across there safely and without having to worry about either of those problems. When you're cutting plywood, you can use these also. If you have 8 of them, and by the way, one's missing because the paint's wet, you can lay the plywood on there, and then you have the same options. You can, if you have to cut a sheet in half, for example, you can go right down the middle, and you can do it safely. You can also reach better, because you can stand on top of it if you have to and guide the saw across. It's pretty difficult to reach across 4 feet of plywood if you have to stand on one edge of it. So this makes that much easier. As far as the design is concerned, it's pretty simple. First of all, I wanted to make it easy to pick up, so left a little ledge on each side of this so I could wrap my fingers around it. Also put holes in the end for the same reason. Recess the end pieces on it so that, again, we could grab it easily enough. And sized it to the size of my hand. Now, my hands aren't too big, so you may want to, if you have larger hands, you may want to make it wider, or if your hands are small, make it narrower to make it easier to pick up. So that was the first priority, make it easier to pick up. Obviously, it's got to bear quite a bit of weight. If you're standing on top of it and there's a heavy piece of lumber on here, you may end up with several hundred pounds on it, but this is made out of 3/4 inch plywood. It's pretty sturdy. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the structure, but I think we have that design parameter covered. The next thing is, this doesn't matter if you don't have a miter saw, but I have a power miter saw, and I wanted to make these the same height as the miter saw table so that I could put these next to it, and if I had a long board, it would support the board. So if you don't have a miter saw and aren't going to buy one, that's irrelevant. But in my case, the table on my miter saw is 4 1/4 inches up from the base. So I just made these 4 1/4 inches tall. Also important that these were easy to assemble. These are not pieces of furniture. I just wanted to bang them together quickly. They're just a utility item. So I wanted to make it very simple to put together. And essentially there's only 5 pieces, all straight cuts, nothing fancy. Just drill the 2 holes, and it's nailed together, and you could use screws if you wish to do so. This is a good project for somebody who has not done a lot of woodworking or carpentry. It's very simple, but it does require measuring and marking and sizing things to a particular size and doing some assembly. So if you have not done a lot of projects and you're planning on doing so, this is really a pretty good little first project to take on. Let's talk about the structural requirements for the crickets. Very difficult to predict what the maximum load would be, so I made some assumptions. I assume the worst case scenario for using these would be if you set a very heavy timber on them, like 12 by 12 timber that you would use to make a timber frame. In that case, I guess that the weight on it from the portion of the timber that that cricket was holding up would be about 200 pounds. And then if you were standing on it and you're a fat old bastard like I am, that'd be another 220. So the maximum weight that might be on one would be about 420. So just for the sake of argument, let's assume that you're never going to have more than 500 pounds on it. Now, so out of curiosity, I wanted to see what the cricket would theoretically support. The weight would be resting on the 2 sides and the 2 cross pieces. The area of the 2 sides, they're each 11 inches long and 3/4 or 0.75 inches wide. So that means 8.25 square inches a piece and a total of 16.5 square inches. The cross pieces would be 2.5 inches times 3/4, 0.75. They would each be 1.875, and 2 of them it would be 3.75. Total square inches of the area bearing down on the ground would be 20.25 square inches. I looked on the internet to see what the compressive strength of plywood is, and several sites I double-checked to make sure the numbers were correct, indicated that parallel to the face of the plywood, in this direction here, the compressive strength of typical plywood ranges from 4,500 pounds to 6,000 pounds per square inch. So theoretically, a square inch of plywood, if you put a load on it, could hold up 3 tons or 6,000 pounds. We have 20.25 square inches here. Using the 4,500 figure just to be conservative, multiplying that out, that comes out to 91,125 pounds, or 45 tons. Now, I think that might be a little optimistic. For one thing, this is not constructed solidly enough to make sure, to keep it from falling apart from the load, from bursting sideways. You'd have to use screws in it. You'd have to have better adhesive on it. Make sure that everything was locked together better. However, for our purposes, if we're going to look at a maximum of 500 pounds load on this, we are way over strength to deal with that. We'll need the following tools for the project. Safety glasses, of course, as always. Pencil and tape measure, of course. Square. Hammer, paintbrush if you decide to paint them. A 5/8 inch drill bit. This is a Forstner bit, which I prefer to use because it gives you a cleaner hole, but a normal spade bit would work fine. The drill, a circular saw, or if you don't have one, a saber saw. And if you're going to cut them with if you have a table saw, obviously it's easiest to do it there because you can be more consistent with the dimensions. But if you do use the saber saw or the circular saw to do it, you will probably need a block plane or regular plane to trim up the pieces to get them to the exact size that we need. For materials, we're going to need plywood. You can also use solid lumber if you have it, but I'm going to use plywood in my case. I recommend you use 3/4 inch. Half inch would be more than strong enough, but the problem with that is when you are trying to nail into it like one piece on top of another, it's harder with the half inch to hit it in a proper place that the nail doesn't blow out the side. So I'm using 3/4 just to make it easier to nail the thing together. You're also going to need sandpaper. I'm using 6-penny finishing nails. You could use screws. Glue. I buy it in gallon containers because it's much cheaper per ounce that way, but you can certainly use a smaller bottle. And if you're going to paint it, you will need primer and whatever paint color you want to paint it. I recommend you paint it either orange or yellow. Those are the standard safety colors, so we are trained and our brains are trained to see that and think caution. So I recommend that you do one of those colors. In my case, I'm trying to scrounge up some paint. I have some red, but I don't have any yellow to make orange with, so I do have white. So these may end up being pink. I guess that we could do this with a half a sheet of plywood. I'm not 100% positive, so let's lay it out and see what we're going to get. By the way, if you decide to make these out of solid lumber rather than plywood, what you will need is 1x6s for the top, which you'll have to rip down into 4.5 inch wide pieces, and you're going to need 1 10-footer, and for 1x4 for the sides, you'll need 4 10-footers. You're probably going to, best bet economically is to use number 2 pine, and that quantity will make 8 crickets, and we'll do 8 crickets for the plywood as well. So let's see what we have. When I estimate, this is a 4x4 foot piece, so 48 inches on each side. Usually when I try to see what'll fit, I start with the largest pieces and lay them out first. However, the second largest pieces, the sides here, there's 16 of them. There's only 8 of the tops, the largest pieces. So what I'm going to do is let's lay the sides out on here first and see what we can get. So the sides are 11 inches and we're going to need 16 of them. So if we do a 3.5 inch strip across the 48 inches, we can get 4 of the sides out of it. That'll bring us to 44. So, and we'll have 4 inches left over here. So that's 4. So we'll need to do a total of 4 rows of that to give us the 44. I'm sorry. We're going to need to do a total of 4 rows of that to give us these 16 pieces for the sides. So I won't, I won't write in each one of these, but that will give us sides 1 to 16. So let's check that off. We have that covered. And let's see how much material we've used so far. That's 4 rows, I'm sorry, yes, 4 rows of 3.5. So that would be a total of 14 inches that we've used so far. I'll just jot that down. So let's see what we can do with the larger pieces. We know we need, for the tops, we know that we need 8 pieces, 4.5 by 13. So 13 inches, we can get 3 pieces across here. So and we'll have, let's see, 3 times 13 is 39. So we'll have a leftover piece of 9 inches. So row across there, We'll get 3 of those in. So we're going to need 2 rows will give us 6, and a third row, partial row, will give us the 8 we need. And we have, these are 4.5 apiece. So the 3 rows have used up, I think, 13.5 inches. So looks like we're going to be able to use 1 sheet and make this work. I'll just check that off so we don't forget. Cross pieces, let's see what we got. We have 16 of those. They're 3.5 inches high and 2.5 inches wide. Well, we have some 3.5 by 4 inch pieces left, so that will give us 4 of those. We can do, so we just need to do 12 more. These leftover pieces from these other rows are 9 inches wide, and that would give us 3 2.5 inch wide pieces, so we can get that out of here. Oops, let me draw that a little better. And we'll have a little piece of waste left over. And those are going to be wider or taller than we need, so we'll have to cut them back a little bit, since these rows are 4.5 and we only need 3.5, but that's okay. So have 4 up here, so we're up to 10. So we have 10 of our pieces covered, so we're in pretty good shape there. And then we'll just cut the other 4 out of the remainder of that row. I have a little waste left over, and we will have a piece left over. Let's see, we got 27.5, so that would be 20.5, right? Yes. We will have a piece left over, 20.5 wide by 48 long. Would not quite have fit in a quarter of a sheet, so we'll have to use a half a sheet, and we'll have this good sized piece left over for another project. We always have projects, so we'll make good use of that. I don't think I mentioned when we were talking about the materials we're going to use that the grade of the plywood. I prefer on a project like this, because you're going to be handling it a lot, to use something with a smoother finish on it. So I believe the plywood that I used was grade BC, B on one side, C on the other. No, actually, I'm wrong. It was AB. There was one A side, one B side. That's a little more expensive than typical construction plywood, which is CDX. There's this C face on one side and D face on the other. It's pretty rough. So I opted to use a little bit better graded plywood. I cut the pieces for this on my table saw just to make things a little bit easier. You're probably going to be doing this with your circular saw, and you may not get the lines perfectly straight on each side of the cut. So in order to clean that up a little bit, what you can do is you can take the pieces for a particular cricket, clamp them together, and then just take a plane, block plane, or whatever you have, and just go along and cut that back to the exact line that you want to cut it back to. But that's how you trim the plywood off. Let's mark these up so we can drill our holes. We determined that we want to put the hole 1 inch in from the end, so I'm going to set my square to 1 inch and just use that to make a line across there. Do the same thing on the other end. And then we're 4.5 inches wide, so that means we need to put to center that hole, it needs to come over 2 1/8 from this side. So what we'll do is we'll put some scrap pieces underneath here so that when we drill it doesn't split out the back side of it. Just line up the center point and we'll have at it. Okay, that's good, and the back side is pretty clean, so that's helpful. So this is working out good. So what I'll do is I'll take the next one, lay the first one over the top of it, line it up, and this way I don't have to measure it again, and that's it, all ready to go. Put our crickets together. First of all, you should probably put some old clothes on, something you don't care if you make a mess of, because we're going to be dealing with glue and paint. Then I also like to put down a piece of newspaper or something that I can throw out afterwards, so we don't wreck the work surface underneath. I'm going to take our glue and pour out a little bit, if I can get the lid off. Maybe. Did this? Okay, it's coming. It's easier to work this way than trying to pour the glue directly onto the project from this great big container. So we'll put that over there. Let's gather our pieces up. We got our sides and our cross pieces. So we'll put the bottom together first. Now, the plans called for each of these cross pieces to come in 1 inch from the end. So what I'm going to do is measure this. This doesn't have to be exact. These are not critical dimensions on this project. If you want to make it more than that, you certainly can. But I'll do that, and we'll take the square. We'll square across there. And then when I put these in here, I'll have we'll have a guideline to go by. So what we'll do is I'm going to use an old paintbrush from my kids use on one of their projects, and I'm going to put some glue on the side of this. Both sides. This is a little more controlled than just pouring it on there and trying to spread it out. So, do both sides of that. Get them ready. More on there. There we go. All right, so let me show you a little trick here. I'll mark this where the outside edges of those cross blocks are going to end up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and start my nails. I do this by eye, but if you're uncomfortable with that, you can hold a piece of the stock up and draw a line on each side to show you where the cross piece is going to land, and then just start your nails right in the middle of those. Is drive the nails in so that the tips of the nails are protruding bottom of the board, and I'll show you why. Okay, so the reason for doing that is that when you put these on, when you have glue on them especially, they tend to slide around. So by putting those nails through there, I can line this up where I want it. Press on a little bit and then drive these in. And that will it'll keep the parts from sliding along, makes it easier to assemble. I already noticed I shouldn't have put the glue on both sides because I'm making a big mess, but anyway, that's okay. So we'll do the same on this side. You'll notice I'm rotating this thing around as I'm working. Being right-handed, it is awkward to try to hold this and nail towards the left end of it, so I'm just flipping it back and forth, and it just makes it a little bit easier to assemble it that way. I'm going to mark on here where this is supposed to go now. According to our plan, we are going to come in 1 inch on each end, so this will overlap each of the sides 1 inch. So I will mark that. Excuse me, get this out of the way here. I'll mark that at the 1 inch mark. Same down here. What I will do is I will go down, make a tick mark. Actually, we can do that without the square. Make a tick mark on each side so I can line this up properly. I'm going to stick it on there. So just take some glue, put some glue on the top. The top overhangs the sides a little bit as we showed in the plans, so I'm not going to measure this. I am just going to eyeball it, and I'll just put my hands around it and try to even the gap up on both sides. If you want to make it perfect, you can certainly measure that, but I can kind of judge where it goes based on that. So what I recommend doing is flipping it and do the opposite corner. This way it's fully secured, can't move it anywhere. I've been using 8 total. That's more than enough. I should mention that it's a good idea to put some safety glasses on whenever you're driving nails, because if you mishit it, it could go flying and go into your eye. In this case, I don't have any safety glasses that have a reading part, a bifocal on them, and so I'm wearing my reading glasses, which is not ideal. I have to get myself a pair of bifocal safety glasses because I'm blind as a bat without the reading glasses at this distance. So, but wear something over your eyes, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but keep your mouth closed, because if the nail does go flying, you may ingest it, and don't ask me how I know. Now, the next step is not necessary, but I am going to set the nails. It really isn't important, but I just like to do it. It's sort of a matter of good practice. And I goofed. I should have set these before I put the top on so it would lay flat, but it's okay, we'll manage. We shall overcome. What's the unofficial Marine motto? Improvise, adapt, overcome. You need to do a lot of that in DIY. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so that's it assembled. Our next step is to clean off all the edges, round them off so that we don't get any splinters. And if you cut this like on a table saw, the edges might actually be sharp enough to cut yourself on if you slide your finger along it. So we're going to break all the edges, round them off just a little bit, just get any splinters off and just make that a little bit more hand friendly. And all I've got here is a piece of 80 grit. We're not trying to make it beautiful, so it's strictly utilitarian. Just get that off there so it feels a little bit rounded off. And make sure you do the underside as well, because that's where you're going to be gripping it, and you don't want to get cut there either, or impaled on a splinter. And do the corners a little bit so that when you're picking it up you don't jam your hand into a sharp corner. Actually, be careful when you're sanding, for that matter, because if there are any splinters sticking out, you could very easily jam yourself. Also want to do the edges, the outside edge at least on that, and then the vertical edge on each of the sides. Might have been a good idea to sand all these pieces before I put them together. Actually, that probably would have been easier, but didn't think of it at the time. When I assemble the rest of them, I think that's what I'll do. Wipe that off just to clean it up a little bit, get the dust off it. I get that, I missed an edge. If you want to, you could certainly sand this some more and make it prettier, fill the nail holes and so forth. Again, this to me is a utilitarian item. I'm not going to put the time into that. However, if this is one of your first woodworking projects, it's a good thing to practice on, because you can't really screw it up and you're not using expensive lumber that you would be upset about if something got damaged on it. So if you want to go further and try to finish this and make it beautiful, that's certainly not a bad idea. I also want to go around the holes here, get any splinters out. Make sure that's okay, because if you're using those to pick up the cricket, you could get some splinters out of that. A lot of times when you drill through there, it kind of breaks out on the back side especially. If you use a Forstner bit in a drill press, these will come out much cleaner. You won't have to do as much sanding. We'll just take care of that. Try to get down in there a little bit. This is actually easier to do with a file. You can get down in there better. Just go around and pull off all the loose fibers and just flatten the back. Okay, so that is ready for paint. I didn't mention in the tools section you're going to need something to open the paint cans with. Screwdriver with a reasonably wide blade is will work just fine. I'm using one of these keys that you can ask for these when you buy paint at the paint store, or the big box store if that's where you're going, and these are quite convenient. They make it much easier to get the lid off the can because they're designed for that. They have good leverage on it. This hasn't been open in a while, so let's see what we get. That's not too bad. Somewhat could use a little mixing, so let me grab a mixing stick. I'm going to put some gloves on just to keep most of this off my hands. Not critical. This is latex paint. And normally, if I was going to do a lot of these, I would pour this into a bucket and paint from there, because basically what you want to do is you only want to get the paint on the last inch or so of the brush. You don't want to soak it all the way up to here. It makes it a lot harder to clean. But in this case, since I'm only going to paint this one right now, I'm just going to work out of the can. And for this, I am going to paint this upside down, and I am going to do the inside, even though it doesn't matter. And I'm going to do that because I do have some OCD, not too bad, but I don't know, it just seems unfinished if you don't paint the whole thing. So I am going to go inside there and just go over that. And then just go around and paint everything. Make sure you get plenty on the edges, because that does soak quite a bit of paint in due to the edge grain. End grain, actually, I said that wrong. It's the end grain in the plywood that sucks up the paint. Now, I don't want to set that down on the paper because the paper will stick to it. Just put in a couple of blocks of wood and just finish it up. Okay, so that's primed. We don't need to go any further with that at the moment. We'll let that dry, and once it's dry tomorrow, we will put a top coat on it, and then we'll be all set. I mentioned that I usually like to paint these orange or yellow. This way you're less likely to trip over them because you can see them. But in this case, I don't have any orange or yellow paint. If I had yellow, I could take the red and make orange out of it, but do not have it. So I'm going to just put a little of this red on a test piece. Oops. See what it looks like. Okay. Make sure you stir this properly and thoroughly. I thought I had stirred it pretty good, and I took some paint out and started painting with it, and it was like water. For a minute I thought I grabbed a can of stain, but actually I did not. I just hadn't stirred the bottom quite well enough, so just make sure you got it good and stirred up. Certainly stands out compared to the white paint that we primed it with, but I want to see what this looks like when I hold it close to the ground, either the concrete inside the garage here or the blacktop outside. I think it's bright enough that it will serve the purpose, so I'm going to go with the red, even though I'm not, even though that wouldn't be my first choice, but that's okay. Project like this, if you're making it out of scraps and so forth, you're trying to economize as much as possible, and I don't want to just go buy paint for this particular item when I have something that is suitable, if not ideal. So we'll just go with this, and that should do just fine. So let's wrap this up. Would there be anything I did different? I did think of one thing after the fact that might have been helpful. As you use these, inevitably at some point you're going to not position them correctly under like a sheet of plywood, and you're going to cut through them. So that's not a big deal. These are cheap and there's not much to them. You can repair it easily enough. But you may, it's a nuisance, and you could also hit a nail and dull your saw blade. So what I could have done was I could have put a second layer of plywood on top of that as a sacrificial layer and just glued that on there. And this way, unless you set your saw too deep, if you do happen to run over it, you would just cut through the top sacrificial layer and you wouldn't damage the underlying structure. If you do decide to do that, you'll have to subtract the 3/4 inch of that extra piece of plywood from the total overall height. So in this case, instead of the sides being 3.5 inches, we would have to take 3/4 inches off that, and that would be 2 3/4, and that would still give us the total height of 4 1/4 to match the miter saw. So that's one thing I would have done. I should mention one other thing, which I made mine out of scrap plywood, so I just use whatever pieces are around. It is better, if you can do so, to orient the pieces so that the long side is going with the grain. The cut is cleaner, and also if you have to take the plane and trim it off, it is much easier to do so. You get less tear out on the edges. For example, here, if you plane along the grain going this way, you're going to get little chips coming out of it, and then that all has to be sanded off. So as far as the costs are concerned, half a sheet of 3/4 inch sanded plywood locally for me is about $33, and you would need one little box of 6-penny finishing nails, 1 pound worth. That's about $6. And a small bottle of yellow carpenter's glue runs about $4.50. So altogether, you'd be in around $44, not including the tax. If you wanted to paint it, you had to buy a quart of primer and a quart of top coat. That would add another $20 or so. But you might be able to find the paint on the bargain rack, as I mentioned. So you'd be in this for somewhere between $45 and $65. That might not seem like a good investment. Else, I guarantee you that if you do a lot of projects, these will pay you back many times over. If in nothing else, a reduction in the amount of cursing and high blood pressure that you might suffer from. So the true maximum load that a cricket will carry, but as you can see, it'll hold up one corner of a very heavy truck. There's about 2,000 pounds on there. So I think we can be confident that for any reasonable load we may ever put on this, it'll carry. So that's a wrap up. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Oh, forgot to mention, enjoy your crickets.